we think back of what the great works of ancient civilizations in the old world were, the Egyptians, the Romans, we don't recognize that here in North America we had our own counterpart to that, a Native American culture that achieved great public works.
What's unique about Hopewell is the scale at which they did things. This ritual, ceremonial fluorescence was an explosion.
The mysteries persist, hidden beneath the surface and among ancient giant earthworks and mounds. From early explorers in the 1700s to archaeologists today, Ohio's Scioto River Valley remains at the center of unanswered questions. The Native American builders were among the ancestors of today's living tribes. They left an enduring earthen legacy, unlike anything else in the ancient world or today's world. Enormous geometric earthworks were built along the Scioto River and its tributaries, often constructed on a grand scale with an intriguing degree of precision. Many designed as combinations of giant geometric squares, circles, and octagons. Repeated over and over again, the geometry of the past is embedded in river valleys, terraces, and hilltops. Most amazing, the earthworks seem to adhere to a grand architectural design, the earthen signature of a bygone culture. Who were these ancient architects? Early explorers followed rivers that brought them by earthworks, cloaked for centuries by ancient forests. Neither the Shawnee nor other tribes in the Ohio River Valley were actively building earthworks, so it was clear that the mounds and walls were built in the distant past. It wasn't until the relatively recent past that precise mapping and aerial imaging, combined with new technologies, allowed archaeologists to peer into the ground and into the past, uncovering another part of the long-hidden story left by Native Americans. Carbon-14 dating of some of the earliest earthwork features pushed the cultural time clock back to over 2,000 years ago. Ohio's ancient earth architects are known to archaeologists as the Hopewell culture. However, no one knows what these people may have called themselves. With no written language, much of their story remains wrapped in mystery.
There is a long continuity of occupation here throughout the woodland period. Hopewell in this area doesn't represent a migration. Hopewell people are the descendants of Adena people.
The Hopewell culture seems to flourish in southern Ohio around 100 BC, and it's an outgrowth, it seems to be an outgrowth of the previous Adena culture that's there. But by 100 BC in central and southern Ohio, we see these changes, the elaboration of Adena to become something new, something recognizably different, and we call that Hopewell.
Unlike later cultures, there were no towns nor villages. The Hopewell people grew food in small garden plots, supplementing a rich diet from hunting and gathering. They lived in single or extended family compounds scattered throughout Ohio's primeval forests.
Archaeologists have never found more than 3 homes in one place. Where did they form community, these people? Because they must have had a sense of community, even though they didn't live in villages. Were these earthworks like surrogate villages? Were they like community centers, like church complexes where people came together for religious and social reasons?
Initially, scholars thought that the Hopewell lived in cities and grew maize, and it would be easy to find these places. But in fact, we know now that they didn't grow maize and that they didn't live in cities either. They lived in very small settlements, and these places are tricky to find because they're so small on the landscape when compared to these large earthwork centers.
I think the earthworks functioned to bring together, to integrate these scattered populations. So the earthworks were the centers of communities. This was where community was built and maintained over generations.
The Hopewell people made excellent use of the rich environment of central and southern Ohio, enabling them to build the largest, most complex earthworks in North America. Hardwood forests of oak and hickory covered the riverbanks and portions of the floodplain. A few isolated prairies may have existed, kept open by repeated purposeful fires as hunting grounds to attract wildlife. For the native peoples who inhabited this part of Ohio, the Scioto River Valley was the best of all worlds, combining plants and animals found in the forest with those found in the grasslands. With its protective hills and slopes, the Chillicothe area shelters some plants which would normally be found 100 miles further north or south. This mixture of plant communities made this region an ideal place to settle. It was a rich storehouse of natural foods, both plant and animal, while rivers, such as the Scioto and its tributaries, provided additional sources of protein with fish and migratory waterfowl.
These were hunter and gatherers principally and fishers, but they also grew native crops. But the farming was probably supplemental to the hunting and gathering diet. So fundamentally, I think the Hopewell had this wonderful mix. They had the richness of the hunting and gathering diet, but they also had the stability afforded by the little seeds and things of the Eastern agricultural complex, which got them through the long winters and probably also provided the necessary surplus to feed all the people who congregated together at these earthworks for the big ceremonies.
The people of central and southern Ohio had ample food supplies. It took only a small part of each day to get enough food to survive. Because of this, Ohio's native peoples had something that allowed them to leave their mark on the land: time. Though they never attained large population densities, somehow the Hopewell mobilized workforces large enough to move thousands of tons of earth. They displayed an amazing ability to communicate and organize on a massive scale and build mile after mile of embankment walls, moat-like depressions, mounds, and ceremonial passageways flanked by earthen berms.
This is a kind of architecture that's like no other that I've ever had to try to figure out in terms of how are people enclosing space or making meaningful forms that can be perceived readily by the human mind, to be conceptualized by the human mind. And these earthworks are beyond all of the spatial perception tools that I think we moderns possess. They're so difficult to grasp spatially and conceptually.
There's nothing quite like the Hopewell of Southern Ohio. This is where the culture achieved its masterpieces of art and architecture and ceremony. There are manifestations that share many of these characteristics in many parts of Eastern North America, but I don't think there's anywhere else that you would call classic Hopewell.
The culture had several major centers. One was on both sides of the Ohio River at Portsmouth. Today, only a small fraction of that complex of earthworks remains. Another focal point was within the present city of Newark, just east of Columbus. There, the Hopewell constructed several large geometric figures and connected them with miles of parallel embankments. The center of the Hopewell heartland was the Scioto River Valley around Chillicothe. The Hopewell constructed 24 major enclosures in the shapes of squares, circles, and octagons. The Hopewell built other works in the Miami River drainages to the west and into present-day Indiana, Yet their influence reached even farther, eventually spreading across much of North America's eastern woodlands.
With each little settlement maybe only having one extended family, how could they get together to build these enormous places that are miles of earthen embankments and untold numbers of cubic yards of dirt that they'd have to move with digging sticks and baskets, carrying one basket at a time? That's the great enigma that I think draws people to Hopewell. And of course, just the grand scale of these earthwork sites just fires the imagination.
Amazingly, all of this occurred before the introduction of corn and large-scale agriculture, and in a culture that had neither towns nor villages. But they did have ideas, big ideas, and advanced understandings of geometry and astronomy to carry them out. Equally important, the Hopewell had the will and the engineering ability to turn ideas into earthworks, moving earth on a scale never before seen in North America.
It's rare in the world of anthropology to see hunter-gatherer cultures creating public works of this scale, this magnitude, and of this complexity.
The Hopewell monumental architecture is on a scale and of a sophistication that rivals any ancient monuments anywhere else in the world. The Hopewell achievement was unique, and it doesn't owe its iconography and symbolism to any other region of America or the world. It really is a local outgrowth, and this knowledge written on the land is enormously sophisticated, including astronomy and geometry.
I think the nearest comparison to these sites, it's the earth and stone circles of the British Isles. And I think the common factor is that these are societies that are making the transition into agriculture. And so that produces a little bit of a change in settlement patterns and cultural ways and what happens with the sky and the interpretation of the sky, and the kinds of monuments that get built tend to be large and they tend to have to do with larger landscape and so forth.
Agriculture is intimately connected with the rise of the Hopewell. The Eastern Agricultural Complex, this suite of local plants grown by first the Adena, then later the Hopewell, clearly is linked to this fluorescence.
Using wooden digging sticks, stone hoes, freshwater clamshells, and baskets, the Hopewell shaped the earth to their liking. Windows to the past, the earthworks allow us to peer back into their world.
The conditions in which the Hopewell culture flowered allowed the time necessary for large numbers of people to devote themselves to building monumental architecture on a scale that's unprecedented in this part of the world. They clearly weren't devoting a lot of their times to warfare. They weren't worried about conflict that they might encounter. This was, it seems, largely to have been a time of peace.
Hopewell Culture National Historical Park preserves and protects 5 of the most significant sites in the Scioto River Valley drainage. At Sipe Earthworks, a 2-mile-long wall enclosed over 120 acres of what was most likely an immense ceremonial complex. As if designed by a single architect or following unwritten rules of Hopewell architecture, the Sipe complex bears a striking similarity to other earthworks in the region. Like many earthworks, 2 centuries of plowing have flattened the profiles of most walls. But Sipe's steep-sided central mound defied plowing. Archaeologists excavated Sipe Mound in the 1920s and unearthed finely crafted art made of exotic materials, some brought in from distant locations. After excavation, the enormous central mound was completely reconstructed. Hopewell Mound Group is the archaeological type site, the signature earthwork example after which these people are named. Owned by a Chillicothe farmer, Mordecai Hopewell, it was excavated in the 1890s. Though we can be sure the ancient builders did not call themselves Hopewell, any knowledge of their language has been lost to time. Hopewell Mound Group includes the Hopewell's largest single mound, a 500-foot-long ridge that required at least 1.5 million baskets of earth to construct. The complex was ringed by a 2-mile-long wall, creating the largest single earthen enclosure they ever built. A long 6-foot-high section of this ancient wall still exists on the upper terrace. Hopeton Earthworks was constructed about the same time as Mound City across the Scioto River. Hopeton's rounded rectangle had walls 12 feet high and was built adjacent to a circle, a pattern repeated at many Hopewell sites. Though still visible in 1930s aerial photographs, decades of continued plowing reduced Hopeton's impressive walls to barely visible undulations on the landscape. Highback Works contains a circle that is the same size as at 4 other sites. The Highback layout and alignments are strikingly similar to the Newark complex, almost 60 miles to the north. We do know that Mound City was a very special place, even in the midst of the impressive array of earthworks. It is one of the oldest Hopewell earthworks, yet it is also one of the last to be used. Though smaller and less precise in its geometry than other Hopewell sites, Mound City contains a greater concentration of mounds than any other earthwork.
It seems to have a focus to the